The politics of the moment are not favouring good international coordination because we are in this point of backlash against man-made globalisation.
The more interconnected our world gets, the more siloed and bureaucratic the decision makers seem to become.
We have to take account of the rise of nationalism and the deep distrust of governments.
We have this 4-year electoral cycle problem, which is that no one gets rewarded for preventing WW3.
When leaders of people don't have that vision of what they are working towards, then you do tend to get policy that is more piecemeal and is on the defensive.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder,
the podcast where we try to find a semblance of order in our mad world.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about disasters and disorder, but it's not all bad. Let me give you an example. Just a few weeks ago, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded hit a sparsely populated region of Far East Russia, and it triggered warnings of a tsunami crossing the ocean heading towards the coastlines of Japan, Hawaii, and the US West Coast. Unlike 2 decades ago, when the disastrous Boxing Day tsunami devastated many countries, this time, disaster warnings have increased markedly. Millions of people were evacuated and countless lives were saved. This is the sort of thing we don't hear so much about, the disasters that are mitigated and the terrible things that are prevented.
Yeah, we try to call a spade on this program, and we need to point out when order sometimes prevails and when international coordination works. So in today's show, we're going to talk about this little-known field of mitigating disaster risk, why we need global coordination and communication for it to work properly, and what are the current state of the treaties and international bodies that govern global disaster response, and maybe at the end, we'll try to extrapolate successful multilateral lessons and how things that work in the disaster risk field can teach us about what might work in other fields, like, for example, how to tackle climate change.
So I'm very interested in how humans can try to work together to deal with the major catastrophic risks that are going to require international cooperation. Risks like nuclear weapons, which were really the first man-made existential threat. Also climate change and, what the large-scale consequences of AI or potentially artificial general intelligence would be for humanity. So I'm interested in those solutions. I also just find it really fascinating to see how people are humans, people are a bit irrational, and humans struggle with some of the biggest problems, partly because they're almost too big to confront. And there's always something more local, more short-term, and more pressing until an actual crisis emerges. So from my last few years of working on nuclear issues and conflict, I got quite interested in trying to understand how people try to get politicians to grapple with the stuff that they really don't want to think about. And initially, I have to confess that I was much less interested in natural disasters, basically because I misunderstood them as natural things that people couldn't do very much about, what insurance companies like to call acts of God, because they seem totally external and totally beyond human control. But over time, I have learned and realised that, in fact, both the incidence of disasters and the impact of disasters often is linked to human actions.
Jane, even what might appear to be an act of God is actually always a delayed act of man, and the two aren't differentiable these days. Of course, doing the probabilities, in other words, being prepared for either an earthquake or a pandemic or a tsunami, is just a question of running your actuarial tables and stepping up. But it's difficult to do that. So you've not just been talking the talk, but as I understand it, Jane, you're someone who likes to walk the walk. You were at a conference where you're exploring this passion of disaster risk. Where was it? Why did you go? How did you get funding? Who did you meet there?
So earlier this summer, I had this fascinating opportunity to go to a sort of semi-conference and semi-retreat organised by the Accelerator for Understanding Systemic Risk Assessment, which is linked to the UN Foundation in the US. And it brought together all sorts of people working on interconnected risks of disasters from a systemic point of view, which was important because basically you need people with really different kinds of expertise. And I've found that sometimes there is a kind of world of knowledge about so-called existential risk, which can sometimes be very abstract. It tends to be heavily populated by a mix of philosophers and tech guys. Sometimes their discussions become super abstract. They come into like, how can we divine the precise probability of a nuclear war happening in 2100, or how do we value the happiness of chickens versus the happiness of unborn children in a particular projection. It really becomes abstruse and divorced from reality. And I found this gathering quite interesting because it brought together people who were analysing global shifts and looking at futures with people with much more hands-on experience in doing things like evacuating people from conflict zones or delivering humanitarian aid in disasters. Also, interestingly, some people from the insurance world too, because they also have an interest in risks not getting out of control, since they will have to pay for some of them. And for me, it came about because of my previous podcast, OK Doomer, which took a light-hearted look at existential risk, and a report that I co-authored called How to Save the World, which really looked at the scale of the risks facing humanity and how people can try to work together to overcome our natural desire not to think about the really tough stuff.
Wow, Jane, very, very cool. I would like to go every summer to the How to Save the World conference, but all I find myself at is the World Championships of Speed Gammon. But they seem to be quite similar because you need to evaluate, like, what is your equity at 4 away, 1 away, Crawford? Oh, it's 85.5%. So this is like the question of, will they come back and have another tornado and a tsunami? And then you need to think about things in a rational and cool perspective when emotion is raging. So that is something that we're also trying to do at the World Championships of Speed Gammon. So I digress. I'm kind of jealous. Who did you meet there? How many selfies did you take? And what kind of risks did you discuss?
In terms of who I met, I was super interested that the first speaker at this event about interconnected global systemic risk was none other than British-Nigerian poet and author Ben Okri, author of The Famished Road. And you'll hear from my interviews why the organisers thought it was important to have a poet there, but it has a lot to do with vision. That we have a global governance system that is struggling to govern existential and catastrophic risks. We have national governments who are also struggling with how to navigate the international system and how to navigate complexity. And part of it does seem to be a loss of confidence and a lack of vision in what people can do together. And that might seem quite romantic, but when politicians and when leaders and people don't have that vision of what it is all for and what they are working towards, then you do tend to get policy that is more piecemeal and is on the defensive and so forth. And so the idea was to start off by actually talking about human potential, what humans can do and what humans can be, and the need to think creatively and imaginatively about a multilateralism that solves the problems of the future, rather than being sort of stuck in the bureaucratic battles of today?
I believe that everything is a win-win-win, which is why I'm wearing my Greek philosophers t-shirt with Plato front and center, because I think that the good for me is the good for you is the good for everyone. And whether it's not smoking or maybe having a more moderate diet where you eat beef, once a week rather than every day, I think that moderation in all of these things produces win-win outcomes for everyone. That's essentially the premise of the Disorder podcast, where we think that if knowledge can be brought to bear in a very Auguste Comte positivistic way, solutions can emerge which are good for traditional culture, good for the future, good for America, good for China, and good for the post-Putin Russian people as well, right? There will be some losers, but for the most part, what is the good is going to be good for everyone. But back to the thing. You interviewed some really interesting people at this conference. Would you tell me about Ruth Richardson?
Ruth comes from a background in philanthropy, and philanthropists think a lot about a lot of this stuff, but there's also a lot of self-questioning going on in liberal philanthropy given the whole state of the world. Her background is in food security, which is affected by pretty much every other issue in the world, and all of the issues that we talk about on Disorder in some way converge when it comes to what affects the availability and the cost of food. So I asked her to tell us a bit more about why she had organised this gathering and why she thought that a bit of poetry was a good way to start thinking about disasters.
Poets are truth tellers. They see things we don't often see, and they'll say things we often can't say in our professional outfits. And I think we've reached a moment in time when we're feeling the effects of systemic risk, when we're experiencing the polycrisis. And I think it's a moment of deep reckoning. And so I think we need those people who are truth tellers, who will actually call out some of the injustices that we see, that will call out the problems that we're experiencing, and that can do so sort of untethered from their professional affiliation or, whatever organization they're representing. Many of us have to carry that with us.
So can you talk us through what are the main systemic risks that the world is facing, and what is it that makes a risk systemic?
So the big risks we're facing include, of course, climate change, biodiversity loss, global health pandemics, geopolitical tension, the decline of democracy, the list goes on. All the things you read about in the news every day, all of those are risks to our societies, to the planet, to the advance on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, poverty, water resources, energy resources. They impact all of those. Risk isn't necessarily systemic in its own right. What is systemic is that the risks are all interconnected. So we saw, for instance, when there was the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that what ended up happening was the Ukrainian farmers weren't planting wheat. So we lost an entire year of Ukrainian wheat. Ukrainian wheat feeds a lot of people in the world, but all of a sudden that was cut off. And so all of a sudden evidence of hunger was going up. We also saw energy shifts in Europe because people started to get nervous about where their energy was coming from. So where we had in many European countries very progressive energy policies, those got rolled back. One could go on and on and on building out that scenario, but you can see how those risks all of a sudden become very interconnected. And so our approach, our belief is that if we have a better understanding of how those risks are connected, then we'll be able to come up with better solutions and responses. So if I can just use an example, COVID, single risk, single response. Put everybody in their homes, put on a mask. Had we actually understood the connection between COVID and a whole bunch of other stuff, we might have come up with different responses that didn't have the negative impacts that we started to see, like the impact on children's education, the increase in domestic abuse, the list goes on. But because we just saw it as a siloed issue, we came up with a siloed response. And then, along with the positive things that happened, many people didn't die, so that's good. But along with that, there are many negative impacts that we may have been able to avoid.
So that's a really interesting example that definitely resonates with me, but I'm wondering, do you see signs that governments have actually learned from that? Are governments starting to look more systemically when a big issue comes or a big shock comes?
I think that I'm not sure that governments have learned from COVID. Let me say that. I haven't seen evidence of any deep analysis or deep learning. It may be out there. I just haven't seen evidence of it. I do think there's evidence of people becoming more aware of systemic risk, the interconnected nature of risks. And I know those conversations happen in the deep, dark hallways of government when things get bad.
Yeah.
However, in terms of how that manifests, we would love to see more uptake in terms of, for instance, in government, multi-ministerial, interchange. We still have very siloed ministries.
Everywhere.
And, there's not a lot of dialogue across those ministries. There's not a lot of collective thinking about how one deals with problems. And this is rife throughout all of our institutions. Philanthropies are still very siloed. They have a climate program. They have a equity program. They have a health program. So you see this everywhere. I think people are becoming more aware of it. It's just these institutions are often big and slow and entrenched. So how do you create change within those institutions? It's one of the big challenges.
Are there any governments that you think are doing this well? Any new institutions or ministries that have been set up to try to think more systemically?
None are coming to mind, to be honest.
Well, that's interesting.
We do have a bunch of case studies on our website. Kate Rayworth's work on the donut economics, really interesting sort of systemic look at planetary boundaries and social floor. I forget what they call it exactly, but anyway, really interesting model. We look at Wales' Future Generations Act, which is really interesting. Again, that's a shining light in terms of how to think about future generations, what the impacts are from a more holistic perspective. There's also really interesting stuff happening at the community level. There's something called community-based natural farming in India, which is really an agricultural intervention to promote and support farmers to farm more ecologically. So that's kind of the impetus. But what they found over time is that the impacts are broad-reaching: gender empowerment, less water use, less energy use. The farmers are getting more money at the market because their crops are more resilient, they're lasting longer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another example at a very community level of how you can sort of see this systemic response, and therefore what we might need to do to encourage other initiatives like that to sort of think in the same way.
Interesting, because I think the concept of systemic risk will make sense to listeners to this podcast, because we talk about global disorder and a lot of different subjects, but we like to look at the linkages between them. But then what always comes up when we're trying to order the disorder and talk about solutions is the realities of living in this world where a lot of politics seems to be fragmenting. There's hyper-partisanship, there's neo-populism, there's a lot of skepticism about international institutions. So how does ASRA's theory of change work? Like, how do you want to incubate change that can lead to systemic responses when politics is so messy?
They certainly are messy right now. You talked about theory of change. At ASRA, we have a theory of transformation.
I like that.
And the theory of transformation is not just to take change to transformation, but it actually provides a broader umbrella to theories of change. We're a network-based organization. We have 90 plus members. Everybody has their own theory of change. Some people feel that change is really going to happen by working with legislators. Other people think that it's going to happen by working with the private sector. Other people are like, no, we have to get the grassroots and work with grassroots organizations. Our theory of transformation embraces all of that because it's going to require all of that.
You don't have to choose and say, this is the one way to change the world.
Exactly, because it's necessary. We've done research on social change. So if you look at women getting the right to vote, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rollback of the apartheid regime, civil rights movement, none of those happened because there was some centralized strategic plan. All of those things happened because a whole bunch of people were working in lots of different spaces trying to engage all sorts of different actors, trying to move forward with generally the same goal, very different tactics, but through all of their efforts, they created momentum and ultimately led to a tipping point, and then you saw change happen. So that's kind of how we see our theory of transformation. It's going to require all of us, all of our members, all the people we're engaging here at the symposium, to move this forward, to try to encourage more holistic thinking, more systemic thinking, more holistic responses, more systemic responses, and to do that in all sorts of geographies at different scales with different actors. So,
Lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
Yeah,
Great
thank
to
you.
be here
Lovely
with
to
you.
talk to you. Yeah.
Well, Ruth has just made some really insightful points, and I think the more interconnected our world gets, the more siloed and bureaucratic the ministries and the decision makers seem to become, when it needs to be the opposite. So, why do you think, Jane, people don't take systemic risks seriously enough to create the long-term planning apparatuses that can deal with things like pandemics or climate change, or even the way in which a war over there causes, tax haven issues over here? This is the essence of the Disorder podcast, that we feel like back in 1950 or 60, when the world might have been more unequitable, systemic risk and the interplay of various geopolitical forces were dealt with better than they are now.
So I think there is a problem of ownership when it comes to any systemic international issues, and the economic concept of global public goods is relevant here. The idea of a public good is that it belongs to everyone, like the air, and it can't be taken away from anyone. Economists originally thought about it in the context of thinking, damn, I cannot charge anyone for this because everyone takes part in it. But the downside is then what people call the free rider problem, that if no one can be excluded from the good, everyone feels they don't have to contribute to its upkeep. And then you start getting problems like people polluting the air, no one stopping that, no one paying for it, etc., unless you have a way to regulate and to create incentives. And when you're dealing with so many different governments, 193 different member states of the UN, then it becomes really difficult to coordinate that kind of collective action. There's also issues that relate to the state of politics in many countries, that when we are talking about war, peace, disaster relief, climate change, we're talking about complex systems. Politicians cannot fix them by themselves, and they also often struggle to communicate what are they trying to fix, what is it that we gain from this, and how can they show some wins. And we do have, I would argue, a growing mismatch between the complexity and interconnectedness of the global issues and a demand for very simplistic national political solutions that look like quick fixes when there aren't very many quick fixes. So your thinking about win-win-win is a great way to think about policy, because people need to see signs of progress, they need to see signals of hope, and they need to not feel like, oh, the whole world is in a perma-crisis. I'm a bit worried about this narrative of the poly-crisis, everything's bad, the world is on fire. Lots of things are bad, but it is very easy to wrongly give the impression that it's too late to do anything, no one can change anything, so why bother?
Right, but lots of things are good, of course. Yes, we may have declining real-world incomes relative to our parents, but our quality of life and of health care and even of housing is better than theirs was. And this is something that's frequently forgotten. Certainly if you live in the non-North American and European world, your quality of life and access to health care and better food and whatever is infinitely better than it was a generation ago for a given income level. And people don't tend to mention that. So yes, I think that it is important to say that there are some things that are better than in the past, but it's not just that we're in a poly-crisis, or you might say an enduring disorder. but rather the reason that we don't get to those win-wins is not that people are too afraid about all the negative, but we have this 4-year electoral cycle problem, which is that no one gets rewarded for preventing WW3, and no one gets rewarded, it seems, for sticking their neck out to propose an end to the war in Gaza in Europe, or, oh, I'm going to be the European leader who is going to host a Putin-Zelensky summit. It's very difficult to stick your neck out because it's like, well, this is how we do things, and like, oh, that's an EU matter, it's not a French matter, and the fact is people get punished for spending research dollars on a threat if they're told that threat didn't materialize. So Trump cut pandemic, preparedness, because he's like, well, there haven't been any pandemics recently, and then there was one. And people don't get rewarded for spending money on something when the threat really materializes. So I'm not sure that democratic electoral cycles is the way to have this problem handled. I would say it's for global governance.
Communications is really a critical skill for anyone trying to get people to take systemic risks seriously, because it is so easy for technical specialists to use language that is impenetrable and that basically keeps the silos going and doesn't make it relevant to the ordinary person. And basically, there is this fundamental challenge in linking the complexity of the issues to the demand for simple political narratives. That's why I really enjoyed speaking to Dr. Lara Mani from Cambridge University, who specialises on understanding and preparing for the risks of global disasters from major volcanic eruptions, which are one of these events that we know will happen, but we don't know where or when. Lara is also really interested in how to communicate effectively to explain why these risks matter and what can be done. It seems one of the problems with systemic risk is that nobody owns that risk, right? If it's everything altogether is the problem, how do you get some government or some organisation to take responsibility for solving it?
Yeah, so volcanic eruptions is a really interesting one in this space. So currently, volcanic eruptions are majorly underestimated in the risk landscape. Because the dominant narrative has been around supercolossal eruptions affecting humanity from this extent, those eruptions are incredibly rare, something around the order, it depends which volcanologist you are, somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 years. But actually, when you look at eruptions, even just a magnitude lower, so on that logarithmic scale, if you come to 7, these are eruptions that can release a lot of ash and gas that can affect our climate. And we've seen volcanic eruptions affect our climate in recent history. Mount Pinatubo in 1991 dropped global temperatures by 0.5 degree.
Wow.
And there's many other instances of that. And so one of the things that we've been doing is, one, trying to change the narrative around the risk to actually make sure it's informed by the science. And so eruptions of this magnitude, we think are as frequent as 1 in 6, or even as much as 1 in 4 per century, based on our understanding of ice core records, which has really given us a deeper vision into the geological record. So we spent a lot of time thinking about changing the way in which we talk about this risk and ensuring that the science is informing the narrative. And then ultimately, having worked in this space for a long time, one of the things we started to realise is that no one's really thinking about the systemic impacts of an eruption like this. So the impact on climate is one thing, and of course, many people think that global cooling from an eruption is possibly a positive in advancing climate change. But actually what happens is it's a short-term cooling. And in that instance, what happens is you still continue to burn your fossil fuels and everything like this. With the changing climate, depends on the type of eruption and how sustained it is. It might last for 1 to 2 years. It could even be a 5, or if you have a long sustained eruption, it could be up to a decade. But once that begins to dissipate, you end up with the climate that you had before and having still continued to burn your fossil fuels. And so that advancing climate change continues, and you snap back to a climate that's possibly even worse than you had before the eruption. All of this is really important because, of course, it affects our food system. So if we begin to have impacts on global climate and rainfall from volcanic eruptions, they also affect global rainfall patterns. That affects our food system, and models suggest that we could lose, in a worst-case scenario eruption, enough crop production for 1 to 2 billion people, up to 3 billion people in some of the worst-case scenarios. which is significant. So, as a result of our kind of research on this space and really thinking through some of these newer kind of ways of thinking about the risk from the science, we realised that no one was really taking this risk very seriously for what it was. So actually we formed a new charity called Global Volcano Risk Alliance. And a big chunk of the charity's work, so it's around increasing global preparedness for impactful eruptions. So it's around increasing monitoring capacity, community-centred education and outreach programs, but also advocacy and getting this risk taken more seriously. So increasing the awareness and working with policymakers to really understand that risk. So we currently, there is no body at the multilateral level that manages volcanic eruptions. So you can imagine if we had one of these large impact eruptions that might affect climate and systems, it's not very clear how we would manage that crisis. Yes, the humanitarian response in the beginning might be a bit more manageable, but if we're not prepared for that climatic impact, and you might have a year's delay from an eruption to the point of climatic impact.
By which time everyone's basically forgotten it happened.
Yeah, or impact on food systems. And how you respond in that early phase will impact how we respond when the climate crisis hits later from the eruption. So it's really important to understand the systemic risk response to this, understanding who are the duty bearers for that risk, where resource comes from, and how we can manage it at that point of crisis. How can we make sure we've got crop planning and exploitation bans in place and negotiations for making sure that everyone is fed? And that's really a focus of the advocacy work that we do.
That has been really interesting to learn from you. Good luck with the advocacy. And we'll see if in a few years' time there is some kind of global council for geohazards.
Yeah, let's see. Well, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jane, we both can sense that the world is faced with a much greater chance of a globally cataclysmic event. What is driving this increased risk? Is it just climate change, or is it, AI and computers and globalization and travel? How did we get to here?
Climate change does seem to be a huge factor. Some people describe that as essentially developing the world's population and economy to a point that is stretching the boundaries of what the planet can tolerate. So some of it is about climate change and warming, but it's also wider than that. It is about biodiversity loss, it's about air pollution, it's about the state of the oceans, the toxic microplastics. All of these things are contributing. Also, great power competition, because the more confrontational international environment that we see has so many knock-on effects. The rapid pace of technological change can be a source of risk, but it also can be a source of good things and ordering, but not if we're all racing to develop these technologies as fast as possible with no constraints because we have to win the AI race. And the politics of the moment are not favouring good international coordination as much as you and I would like, Jason, because we are in this point of backlash against man-made globalisation. Lots of people expressing a frustration with the economic impacts of free trade, migration, financial liberalisation. But there are some things that are global and just are global. There are just like air, like weather, that just cannot be contained. You cannot put up walls or borders that these things will respect. So, countries may be able to protect their food security by having more localised food production and diversifying their supply chains, but there will be other climate-related risks that can't be dealt with without sustained global action. At the same time, we can't have just global prescriptions for every country to follow in the same way. Heat was something that I heard quite a few people discussing, because what counts as extreme heat that can kill people is totally different from country to country, depending on how the population live, what their tolerance is like, what their buildings are like. So you might have, people dying of heat in one country where another country could tolerate that level of heat perfectly well. There needs to be some interplay between global best practice and understanding what works in your community.
Yes, Jane, this is all the stuff we heard right after the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic broke out in 2020. The interconnectedness of our supply chains and our food production networks is what allowed the pandemic, and climate change is what pushed a lot of these wildlife out of their normal habitats, and genetic engineering is what will make our crops ready for a systemic failure because we only have one breed of apple now rather than the 120 that there had been previously. So a lot of the ways that we've tinkered with the environment make it susceptible to mega risk. What is the impact of weakened global governance on the ability to deal with this risk and to create what I call robustness, and that Brian Klaas has talked about in his book Fluke, which is just diversification?
So the weakening of global governance really is one of the risks, I think. It's part of the risk. And somehow we have to navigate it. We have to find policy recommendations that take account of the rise of nationalism and the deep distrust of governments in many, many places. That said, I think part of what we're seeing right now is the US really taking a totally different position on the global governance than it has over the last 80 years. That doesn't mean the whole world is going the same way, and naturally, smaller countries tend to be bigger fans of global governance because they cannot be hegemons. They know that they need to build coalitions and coordinate. So, there is also a strong appetite for international solutions. It's mainly the so-called great powers that think that they can be exceptions.
So, Jane, you spoke to someone directly about how climate change is impacting our ability to handle major existential risk. Who is she and what did she say?
I spoke to Catalina Jaime, who is the head of a climate and conflict centre that is operated by the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So because of their humanitarian role internationally, they have been growing their ability to analyse upstream how humanitarian crises are going to look in future and how civilians are going to be affected by the interplay of conflict and climate risks. This week has been the anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, but the protection of civilian in conflicts has changed in various ways since that time, partly because of the climate security nexus. But let me bring in Catalina because she can explain much more clearly than me the fascinating stuff that she works on.
The humanitarian sector has evolved quite a lot over the last 150 years. But I think particularly in recent history, I will say in the last 3 decades, it has evolved being able to be more efficient, to be able to be faster, to be able to really reach out as many as communities as possible. At the same time, facing more and more and more crises.
Yes. Yeah.
And normally, the normal modus operandi is that you have one hazard and then you respond to that hazard. But I think more and more over the last years, we see the crises are so complex. That just to mix everything is happening at the same time. I mean, already 20 years ago it was happening, but I think now it's even more.
And why? It's because climate change is accelerating, global governance is weakening.
So I think climate change definitely is playing a key role. We are seeing the impacts of climate change now. So we have a series of new events that are unprecedented, that are more severe. At the same time, we have a growing population. One of the areas that I focus quite a lot in my work are people affected by conflict, by armed conflict and violence, which are often the most extremely vulnerable because they're normally, if you have a conflict, then you have basically impacts in the infrastructure where you live, the hospitals are destroyed, people is traumatized, your home normally, you need to leave your home because it's super dangerous, and then you just go and live who knows where. So there is this disruption of your well-being, of your health, of your network, of being far from your family. So then you have that as a baseline. And then on top of that, you have the impacts of climate change and other hazards So, of course, that's where we are starting to see more and more humanitarian crises.
So how should the sector respond? Because it seems like a time where, the sector is facing these growing pressures. It does have a lot of know-how, but then also aid is being cut. There are many people who seem to think like aid is pointless because disasters are still happening, so why do we have to spend money to fix them? So how can the humanitarian world start to adapt in this kind of atmosphere now?
So I think there are different elements to this. So it is certain that we shouldn't just be focusing on the response. Like if we really want to make sure that humanity, can live with dignity and, well-being. Yeah. So that long-term or short-term, how do we reduce those risks? Like how do we create the strategies that enhance awareness, that have a structural mitigation, like flood barriers, like all that thing that will be able to reduce risk is super important. So that's one element to it. Then there is an element of like being able to be better at anticipating crisis using risk analytics and forecast information, because there is a possibility. This is something that in the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and in the wider humanitarian system, we have been working already for quite some time. Like, how can we be better at doing early warning and early action based on forecast, allocating funds to do early action? So that's one piece of the equation as well. And then the other element is that how do we respond better, and then how do we recover better? So I think in terms of what is here for the humanitarian sector and, what do we need to do is first because of the financial crisis, but also the structural issues that the humanitarian sector has, the moments of crisis offer opportunities. So we need really to rethink what do we want the humanitarian sector to be in the next 5, 10, 50 years. So this is the moment to do that. And the way that I see it is that it shouldn't be necessarily a humanitarian sector just in the way how it is now, that it's just responding to emergencies, but that is really connected across these time scales that I was just mentioning.
Yeah, that's great. And I think part of it is also about communicating, like why these things are happening, why people have to own the problems. Because I think people do look at problems getting worse and then they can sometimes blame the aid sector for not preventing them. But that's not been the job of the aid sector. The aid sector is mopping up the messes. But when the causes are complex, also people kind of shy away from them.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. That definitely is the case, no? And I think in the humanitarian sector, we're now very conscious that we shouldn't be necessarily the ones that are at the end of the moment of the disaster and picking up pieces, because part of that evolution of the humanitarian sector has implied that we're very close to communities. Many humanitarian agencies have been in many, many very vulnerable places of the world for many, many years. So there is this kind of really close connections with communities, and there are many, many national and local humanitarian organizations. So I think there is that power of connection at kind of different levels. And I think we need to make sure that a lot of that funding and a lot of that kind of support that a lot of these local organizations need is there so they can actually deliver.
That was great hearing from Catalina. Now, Jane, would you order the disorder with me? How do we make it so that preparedness, which has worked so well in this issue of the tsunami, could play out in other parts of our society?
Defence spending pledges made at the recent NATO summit, where countries have said that they will up their defence spending to 5% of GDP. But in fact, 1.5 percentage points of that 5% is dedicated to resilience. NATO defines what that means, but it isn't just resilience against invasion. It's resilience against all manner of disasters, particularly thinking about those that are man-made, but not only. So, given that that's where a lot of the money is going to be going, working out how to use that money smartly so that it is about having societies more prepared against a variety of shocks, that's going to be really important. There is always a big risk of preparing for the last war or preparing for the last pandemic. There were those that thought the UK and US were really well prepared for a pandemic, But in fact, they weren't well prepared for the COVID pandemic. They had not foreseen exactly how it would play out. So there needs to be a kind of risk agnostic resilience, if that's not too jargony, investments in resilience that could be important no matter what happens. One of the interesting things here that is in the hands of people is about communities and societal resilience. Societies with strong social bonds tend to do better in disasters, and that is just logical. If you can go to your neighbours for help, if you can go to your families for help, if someone's checking on the old man upstairs who doesn't have family, people are safer. People can protect one another. And this is probably one of the key things that all of us can work on, even if governments are lagging behind.
And it's beyond just having a strong society. It's about the trust between state, government, and society. Taiwan, who had the vaccine very late and had tons of people coming from China to it, did amazingly well in responding to the pandemic. Oh, why? Because when the government says something in Taiwan, the Taiwanese do it. It's not only that they have a rally around the flag effect, but there's a huge amount of social trust there. And this gets at a topic which I'm very passionate about. I'll call it state capacity and societal capacity.
Yeah.
The Scandinavian countries have it, East Asian countries have it in spades. In some ways, Israel has this capacity. In some ways, Canada has it. But if we just stick at the Scandies and the East Asians, they are beating the Anglo world in this every way. If the society rallies around a thing there, people do it. They don't need to have it imposed on them. They take the social cues and they check in on the neighbors and they have a degree of groupthink, whereas we think of groupthink as being negative. In disaster response, groupthink can be very, very positive. And the Anglo world's, I'm just going to do my own thing, no one can force me to, is actually probably good for stock trading and entrepreneurship, but really, really bad for disaster response. So, given where we're at, I don't see in the Anglo world that we're going to get this societal strength, because everyone is believing different conspiracy theories. We have hyper-partisanship, not just in the US, but in the UK. And we have to also point out that the US, which is a big leader in any kind of global disaster preparedness, like the CDC had offices everywhere in the world. And Trump wants to reallocate $4 billion in federal funding away from natural disaster, and he's already moved it away from global health. So where does that leave us?
There are real problems with the destruction of scientific knowledge that is going on in the US. A lot of the early warnings for disaster has drawn on US data that is now basically being deleted. There are a lot of losses to worry about. But there is also a lot that the rest of the world can do. And that, Europe can step up and look at investing in science, something that, we have historically been quite good at. We aren't able to depend or even arguably free ride on the US, but let's think about that in terms of science and knowledge and education, and not only in terms of the defence spending that has dominated the debate. Social media is definitely something that can eat away at the societal cohesion that we need. I don't know how governments can answer that, really, because clamping down on it doesn't work. But I think we just all need to be aware that there are lots and lots of forces that deliberately want to sow division, and it's not reality.
There are many forces, Jane, but as we try to order the disorder for the mega orderers, we want to give them one takeaway lesson for what can work. As we have examined natural disasters, what has this told us about ways that coordination can be successful and can help us deal with the range of man-made disasters happening across our geopolitical world, from Ukraine to Gaza to tax havens to mega corruption?
We need to keep our eyes on the prize, basically, that there is a common human interest in working together to safeguard ourselves against the worst risks. So there is a need for cooperation, even when we're all annoyed with each other and don't like each other. And people like our listeners who want to solve problems can definitely benefit from looking at the larger picture, looking at the systemic picture. You're never going to know everything, but build your networks with people who can bring that larger lens to things, engage in conversations with them. Don't be put off by gatekeepers who use jargon to sort of make their disciplines insular. Find good sources that can tell you clearly and comprehensively about how the issues they work on connect up with the issues that you work on, and try to find common lessons that we can help each other with.
Yeah, trust the experts. If they say that there's a tsunami headed your way, you probably shouldn't just stay in your house. You should believe them. So we need to create a society where experts can be trusted.
Hear, hear. And listen to the Disorder podcast. We really do our best to bring you credible experts, people who, A, want to find the truth, and B, want to propose solutions so that we can have this conversation about disasters and not walk away going, oh my God, it's so bad and the world's about to end, but think, okay, humans are actually quite good at dealing with a lot of this stuff, and there's more we can do to work together to look after each other. And as Jason says, you know, if they say there's a tsunami coming, do listen.
If they say there's a tsunami coming, please go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. It helps others discover us.
And if you too want to help order the disorder, you can tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every episode launches.
Don't forget to check out our new YouTube channel. If you want to see highlights from these discussions, as well as exclusive extra videos about topics like Gaza, Ukraine, backgammon, then please consider subscribing. The link is in the show notes.
And for more on today's topics, we have a Substack too. And guess what? That link is also right there in the show notes.
Our producer is the mitigator of all audio risks, George McDonough. Disorder is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
Thanks for listening, and hope you have an orderly and disaster-free week ahead.